I had known Aspen because I'd grown up in Denver and had come up here to ski the very first winter that there was a chairlift here. I came up with one of my pals, and we stayed in a bunkhouse. Actually, the first night we didn't even have bunks. We just slept on the floor of the house for 50 cents a night. And we liked the town so much that we started coming back winters and summers, camping and going out the dirt road to Maroon Lake where nobody else would camp, except maybe the 4th of July. There might be one other person camping. And then when Carla and I began to get serious about getting married, I insisted that she come up here.
I was tested in the mountains.
And a whole group of us came up, and Carla decided, yes, these mountains are pretty interesting after all. We continued to come up occasionally. And in the summer of, it was either 63 or 64, my sister was spending the summer here taking an art course. And we came up to see her. There was some kind of art show she was involved in. And she said, oh, I must introduce you to a scientist and his wife that I've gotten to know. And it turned out it was Marty and Bea Block, who were here for their first year, I believe, at the Physics Center. And they told us about the Physics Center. We dropped in to see. It turned out there were a couple of other people that we knew who had come that year. And we thought, this looks great. Next summer, we came back to the Physics Center and decided we should start looking for a place. Well,
and that was very important because we had moved to Chicago.
Well, we were just about to move to Chicago then.
In 64.
And we actually looked at a house over on Gillespie, just across the street, basically from the physics, almost across the street from the Physics Center, across the street from where the Frasers now live. And we decided we didn't want that house because it would have cost us more than our house in Chicago, which we'd bought at the dead bottom of a terrible market. And so this was a big, nice old Victorian, which was selling for $45,000 in Aspen, if you can imagine that. But the next summer, we found the place that we did decide to buy, which is outside of town and up with a nice view. And we built the house in 67, 68. And basically, we've come here every summer except a few when we were not in the United States. But basically, we've come every summer since then. The first year or two, I remember having a desk, not in Stranahan, but in the Marquand House. You remember the Marquand House was a very nice old house just down at 3rd and Gillespie. I believe it doesn't exist anymore. There's another, it was torn down and something else bigger and more elegant was built. At that time, several houses around the town were offices. We just had one building, Stranahan Hall. I don't remember what year Beta was built, but I'm sure that lots of people talking here do. Actually, I should put in one little bit of background too, that I have some relatives who were in Aspen in the mining days. In fact, this year we stopped off to visit my aunt who was born in Aspen, who hasn't come here for probably 10 years. She turned 100 this summer. This is Dorothy Colby. She and her now deceased brothers would come up sometimes, and we would hear lots of wonderful anecdotes. And all during the years before the first time I came up skiing, my oldest cousin in that family, who still likes to come up here, kept trying to persuade me to come up to Aspen. And I would resist because I'd say, why should we drive what was then 5 or 6 hours to go all the way to Aspen when we could go to Estes Park in 2? And from Denver, that seemed like the natural thing to do. And of course, I didn't appreciate Aspen until I actually did come to ski. Well, the Kobe family still has a legacy here in town and in the area. One of our favorite places, as Carla said, to picnic and where we found mushrooms is Kobe Park. That was given that name because it was a logging area. The Kobe family didn't build, but they did buy and own the sawmill that used to be in Lanedo. They weren't miners themselves. They had a store and a sawmill, and they supplied lumber for beams in the mines. Some of them came down to Denver. A few of them stayed even well into the 30s. But there was a feeling that there was always an attachment between our family and Aspen, even that I didn't take advantage of until very late. Very late, I was 14. I've always liked to work on the border between chemistry and physics, but the Aspen Physics Center has been a place where I could talk with people about areas of physics that were completely new to me, and I could talk with them about things that I was doing that turned out to be relevant to things they were doing. I think that some of the areas that are strongest and most popular here are not the areas where I've been working. I haven't worked in particle physics. I haven't worked in traditional condensed matter physics. I've worked in other parts that are considered fringy. But one of the things that the Physics Center did was provided a vehicle for us to have a whole series of conferences on what became known as finite-time thermodynamics. We had 3 conferences over a period of 5 years, I guess, 79, 81, and 83. Very international conferences, and this has grown into a fairly sizable active area with lots of implications for energy efficiency and things like that, besides basic thermodynamics. But in 1983, we had such a good conference that we wanted to have one in 1984. And we'd been, as I said, coming every other year. And Aspen was getting pretty popular, so there was really no way we could get a slot in 84. We would have been expected to wait till 85. So what then happened was one of my former students and I decided to try having a conference in 84 down in Telluride, which had never had any kind of scientific meetings at all. And so there was a very, very successful 3-week conference in Telluride in 84. It was so successful that there were 3 conferences there in 85. And now it's become a very important institution in Telluride. They will have had 380 scientists there this summer in a whole series of workshops. It's been, in many ways, spawned by the idea of Aspen. The Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies was really the sort of mother organization for the Physics Center. The Physics Center was originally part of the Institute, and there are 2 not quite agreeing stories about how evolution occurred. There are those who say, oh, it was always the intent of the Institute to create and spin off these other organizations. And then there are those who say, well, there are certain people in the Institute who didn't like science, and they kicked us out. But in any case, When we first came to the Physics Center, it was a branch of the Institute, and within a year or two, it was independent. I think it's been fine. I don't think it's done any harm, maybe benefit for the Physics Center. It may have not been beneficial for the Institute in the sense that I think they could probably use more scientific input. But in, I guess, it was well after the oil crisis of '73, there was a summer-long institute study of energy efficiency. And I was involved in that study. That summer, I actually spent much more time with the Institute than with the Physics Center. And it was a wonderful conference. It really generated some great ideas. And the Central Core Committee was excellent. The final product was a disaster. The chair of the committee was a journalist who insisted on writing the report. And those of us who were on the core committee had nothing to do with it. It sort of disillusioned me about the Institute for some time because the report was hollow. The study was very, very substantive. It was wonderful. Each week, the core committee would bring in 2 or 3 people who were real experts in some specific area. And we realized that a pattern developed. These people would come knowing what the central problem of energy was. And of course, it was their field. And they would tell us about this, and we would listen. And we would try to integrate it into the other things that we'd learned. And we would begin to ask questions. And about Tuesday midday, a tension would grow between them and us. And about Wednesday afternoon, there would be sort of a break in the clouds, and suddenly they would see what they were talking about in the context, the larger context that we were thinking about. And every week you could predict that there would be a happy ending to the whole thing. And the realization of that kind of integration was a very important part of wonderful part of the education that we all got. And I think even the specialists too. But the Physics Center, I think, has pretty much stayed away from anything as applied as that. It's remained much more interested in the pure basic science, and that's fine. Well, I think that one of the most important things has been its tradition as a place to explore new ideas. This was also, by the way, something that we carried to Telluride and tried to insist on there. I think that one of the great dangers to the Physics Center is a tendency for workshops to become places for speech making, for presentations of work that's finished, and the people who did it are very proud of it. They want people to know about it. They want to be honored and respected for it, which is perfectly natural. But that isn't what we should be doing here in Aspen. And I think that Aspen has just been wonderful for having workshops where people throw out unsolved problems and try to figure out how to think about these. Even more extreme, how to formulate new questions. This to me, of course, is the most exciting thing we can do in science, is recognize the new questions that, oh my gosh, why didn't I put it that way before? And Aspen, I think, is one of the rare places where this can be done. Even Gordon conferences can't do that anymore. But Aspen, I think, can and should. And I think it's important for Aspen to try to preserve that. One of the keys to doing that, I think, is for people to stay here long enough to learn what other people do and then start working on things.
Well, perhaps a feminine view or a female view of the Physics Center for those of us who are not physicists or even chemists on the borderline of physics. We had a very good time and a very close communion with other wives and our children. And this started very early because in the very early days, we were rather small and we went off on hikes with Randy that were very carefully planned. And there were the picnics, which
With
were
kids?
always with children, that were taking place in various parts of the surrounding countryside. So we got to know all these wonderful places to go that we still go to, such as the grottos, and our grandchildren go to the grottos. But that created a very close communion, a community, I really should say, between the kids who grew up together and the wives who shared all sorts of stories about being married to physicists or scientists. And we also shared a lot of other things because there were a lot of school teachers, social workers, psychologists among us. So we had a sort of community there. Later on, that began to drop out as the center got older and bigger, and people didn't stay as long. So in those days, there were other things. Well, hiking was always something that brought families together, absolutely. And, well, I guess mushrooming was another thing that began to be important in those days. People would go off and compare their mushrooms, and there were long conversations. How did the mushrooming start?
Well, I think you should describe that with the finding of that first big bolete up in Kobe Park.
Yes, well, Kobe Park was a wonderful picnic area and gorgeous views, and it's above Lanado, for those who might not know that. Up Woody Creek and up Lanado, and then further and further up into the mountains. And we did find this gorgeous big mushroom, which looked like something we had in a mushroom book at home. And so I gathered it, and Steve and I think you asked me to eat it first.
But then you insisted I taste it first.
And it was wonderful. And this was a porcini or Steinpilz, Sepp, whatever you want to call them. And this was exciting. So Hildy Gassiorowicz and I, the next summer, I think, took a mushroom course given by Roby Albuy, who, as a Swiss, was a great mushroom collector and fun to be with. And he had slides, and he also, the important thing was that he took us to good collecting places. And we really got into this. And it was after one of those trips that the Gassiorowiczes and we went for dinner at Maurice's of the Alps. And it said mushroom soup on the menu. And we, feeling very wise and all, said, "Oh, of course it's wild mushroom soup, isn't it?" And the flustered waitress said, "Well, I don't know, but I'll ask Maurice." And Maurice came out just delighted and told us that he collected mushrooms. And this
The mushrooms
wasn't
in the soup.
were not, but he had wild mushrooms.
And because of asking and our curiosity, he would make us a special dish,
With his
which he
wild.
did.
And we began to talk, and then we learned about the fact that he gave cooking classes. And so we got all excited about that. And I think Sid Meshkoff was involved in the very first cooking class.
As is in some of the early mushrooming.
And
too.
were you in?
Not the first, no. Not
no.
the first. We did go.
But those who like to eat well quickly learned about the cooking classes, which were truly classes. Helene Slansky would take very careful notes of the first course,
Pretty
less
good notes.
well notes of the second course. And by the time dessert came around, we had all drunk a good deal of wine, which came with the cooking class. So we never had dessert recipes. But she did send out to everybody these notes, and the cooking classes became a very, very popular kind of entertainment.
And the mushrooming has certainly continued and become something of a tradition, although some of us feel a responsibility to advise people who have not gone that they shouldn't go mushrooming, that it's too dangerous. One of the things that I think has been important for many of us who've been coming here for a long time is the attachment not only that we have, but that our children and grandchildren have.
And some of that started very early on. As we said, we all hiked together, and there was a community of kids.
Oh, absolutely.
They put on plays together. They got into mischief together as they grew up. And we've seen that because some of our kids have retained really close friendships with people that they grew up with here.
Absolutely. I think one that's especially apparent is the close friendship between our youngest, our son, Eric, who lives down the valley in Carbondale, and Sid and Natasha Meshkoff's son, George. They became very good friends when they were about 6 years old, and they are still very good friends. They sometimes go fishing together.
Well, they lived together for a while.
They did live together for a while.
Until Eric's now wife kicked out George.
But all three of our kids, both daughters and Eric, have lived here. And our oldest, Andrea, was a photographer on the Aspen Times for many years, and then became an independent photographer, and married and had her two sons here in Aspen. And they are very attached. In fact, they'll be coming here Saturday. And our second daughter, Denise, didn't live here as long.
She lived here 2 years.
But she
and did a lot of theater.
But she still comes back every summer and performs at the Snowmass Family Fest and at the library here as a storyteller. So her kids, too, have a great attachment to this area. And I don't think that's unusual. I think that a great many of the kids of our contemporaries, now grown, feel the same attachment to Aspen. And we can see this.
We don't happen to have any science kids, but there have been generations of scientists who have come as well, which is always exciting.
And of course, our son now, being in Carbondale, has a slight disdain for Aspen. But he still comes up to ski as often as he can. And of course, the skiing, too, was very important. And I think that one of the interesting things that I know you're including in this is the development of the winter program of the Physics Center, which I think was a brilliant idea and not necessarily an easy thing to do. But I've only been able to come once to a winter program. And actually, we didn't really quite come to a winter program. Three of us from very different places wanted to work together, and it seemed that Aspen was a very nice location. It was a problem related to condensed matter. There was a big condensed matter workshop going on that winter here. So we came at the time of that workshop. But when everybody in the workshop came in to listen to speeches, we simply stayed at the blackboard and shouted at each other. And it was a very productive week or 2 weeks and led to lots of interesting results. And we could talk to the people who were here for the conference who knew about some aspects that we didn't. And so we came away with a very strong sense of that the winter program is, although not nearly as extensive, is also very, very fruitful. And we think it's a great thing to have. I served on the board for whatever the maximum term was, because I really felt that I wanted to do what I could to help this organization maintain and strengthen itself. I love this place, and I still feel that way, that I'm delighted to do whatever I can to help it. Being on the board was just one of the ways that I think those of us who use this and care for it can take part. And I think perhaps in retrospect, I probably should have even done more. But it was interesting. It was challenging. I think it made those of us on the board feel even closer to the organization, and I think it's remarkable how loyal by far the greatest majority of participants here have become.
Yeah.
It's an indication of what it really is.
Great. One of the amusing things and group activities that happened at the Aspen Center for Physics happened when Murph Goldberger and his wife Mildred descended upon us. And Mildred would say, "We have to have a show." And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, she had whipped the various people into line, and a number of skits were developed,
Music
which
was
we
written?
presented in a nightclub, an empty nightclub in Aspen, and various people spoofed hiking, mushrooming, physics, science. Steve Gassiorowicz, I think, was the great script writer of several of these skits, and the Zacharias
Oh, yes, you
were
remember-
involved. Elaine Pagels and you arranged
One
an affair on top of a mountain.
Well, we tried. Elaine and I had climbed from opposite sides ahead of our parties in order to be able to meet and arrange an assignation. And we whipped out our little books. This was long before Palms. And we almost could make it 2 weeks from then, but it didn't work. And then we had to look further and further and further forward. And finally we figured out that we could meet for 2 hours in the Kathmandu airport 2 years hence. And at that point, the rest of the parties came up and we went into a mushroom thing.
But
there was
then
also one of Steve Gassiorowicz's. There was a plane crash in South America that became the subject of a book.
Called Alive, I think.
What?
Alive.
Alive, yeah, it had to do with some cannibalism. And so Steve's line was, "Oh, did you read Alive? No, but I read the review in Gourmet."
But this, I think, carried on the tradition of the physical review, which had come out of Harvard with Tom Lehrer.
And Lou Branscombe.
But we all
and
had
Dave
a
Robinson.
very good time putting these on. And there were 2 of them, I believe.
Yes, and
not
successive years, no.
But there was a small
and
group of years.
somehow Mildred got everybody enlisted. Huge numbers of people wrote skits, wrote music, rehearsed, went out and drummed up.
children were involved.
Oh, yes.
Murray Gell-Mann's kids, I remember, did a Monty Python whole skit. I
Yes.
think they had memorized all the Monty Python at that time. Yeah,
All the kids.
all the kids really had fun. Yeah, so this was part of the summer camp in Aspen.
We did have some events out at Pine Creek when Stuart Mace was there. Another thing we did with Stuart, we had, I think, 3 sort of tutorials by him about Navajo Indians
Sand paintings.
and sand paintings.
Because
Well, just
we were
Navajo
going to buy a
tradition.
sand painting, he said, well, you have to understand this painting.
He
You
would-
can't just look at it as pretty. And we
You have
said,
to-
okay, how do we learn? And he said, well, I'll teach you, get some of your colleagues.
Well, we asked him if he would do it with colleagues.
I think
and-
the Simmons were involved.
Oh,
in
there were about 20 people at each of these, and they were wonderful. And we tried to tape them, and the taping didn't work.